my pleasure today to introduce Christian Murphy, who got his PhD at Carnegie Mellon and is now at AI2 down the street working on semantic parsing.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Jant. And today I'm going to talk to you about some work we've been doing on, well, developing probabilistic models for learning the lexicon of a semantic parser. So for those of you who are familiar with semantic parsing, let me just summarize this talk in like 3 minutes. No, 30 seconds. You'll know that learning a lexicon is sort of a fundamental subproblem of building a semantic parser. It's like the first thing you have to do. OK, so learning a lexicon is the first thing you have to do when you build a semantic parser. And the quality of the lexicon that you learn significantly affects both the accuracy of the final parser that you train, as well as its efficiency. So in this talk, I'm going to present some probabilistic models we developed for learning these lexicons. And these models have some attractive properties. Specifically, they can be trained from weak supervision, by which I mean question-answer pairs, for example. Other kinds of weak supervision as well. Secondly, they have convergence and optimality guarantees. So specifically, one of our models actually has a concave objective function, which means you can actually find the global optimum when you optimize it. And finally, I'll show that they are actually effective by presenting some empirical experiments on some data. So that's my executive summary for the talk. For those of you who aren't familiar with semantic parsing, let me get you up to speed. So semantic parsing is the problem of translating from a natural language question or statement to a formal representation of its meaning known as a logical form. And this is a useful problem because you can use it for tasks such as question answering and other things like that. So the way to think about this is that the logical form is a little database query or a computer program that you can evaluate to get some value, which is actually the answer to the question. Okay? So in this case, I'm going to use this sort of lambda calculus notation for these logical forms. And basically what this says is whenever you see these lambdas, think that we're looking for the set of things x that satisfies this property. So this thing says, find me the set of things x that are cities, and x is in Texas. And then the argmax says, get me the biggest one of those, which gives you Houston, hopefully, based on your database. So hopefully, if you think about this for a minute, you'll realize there's a lot of tasks you can actually formulate in terms of the semantic parsing, in terms of building a program that evaluates to the answer that you want. And this is sort of a classic application. In this talk, we're actually going to look at a different application of semantic parsing that we're interested in AI2. So we're interested in sort of answering these diagram questions. So here, the input is actually a diagram, but I'm going to assume it's sort of parsed out. These are sort of food chains. So basically, these diagrams have animals, and they tell you which animals eat other animals. So they just show you which animals eat other animals. And you get a question like, if all the frogs died, what happens to the raccoons? So based on this, we can define a sort of a little theory of how food chain causation works, right? If grasshoppers die, frogs will decrease, things like that. So we can translate this into a sort of similar semantic parsing problem. So hopefully this gives you an idea of the kind of generality of problems you can tackle with semantic parsing. Now, I wanted to say one more thing, which is notationally, I'm going to use this sort of blue font for things that are language. I'm going to use this purple color for logic-y things. So just, that's like a thing you can keep in your head to keep things straight. OK, so now let's say we have this new task, for example. We want to train a semantic parser for this problem. How do we actually do that? Well, there's basically a two-step or one-step process for training a semantic parser. This is sort of a high-level sketch of every way to build a semantic parser ever. I'm going to do it in terms of CCG, but the problems they have to solve here are kind of general for other semantic parsing formalisms. So first, obviously, we're going to collect a data set. And in practice, that data set's probably going to be question-answer pairs, right? So I can go on Mechanical Turk or something like that and gather a bunch of questions that look like this. Next, what we need to do is we need to create a lexicon for our parser. And this is sort of the lexicon learning problem that we're going to look at in this talk. But what this lexicon is it's basically a mapping from words in the language to sort of logical form fragments, little program fragments that we're going to assemble in parsing to actually get the logical form for a whole sentence, OK? So you can think about this as sort of like inducing the grammar for a parser or something like that, if you're familiar with syntactic parsing. And this lexicon learning problem is sort of the first step in building a semantic parser. Now, once you have the lexicon, the way you actually get your parser is actually very simple. You can just train a parser using your data set. This is some sort of structured prediction problem. You can do it by optimizing log likelihood or something like that. Use your favorite algorithm here. This parameter estimation is fairly straightforward. OK, so this is my high-level overview of building a semantic parser. We're going to look at lexicon learning in this talk. I wanted to say that you can look at this problem of lexicon learning as sort of maybe something weird in isolation, maybe something you only have to do for CCG, which is a particular semantic parsing formalism. But I think actually if we think about this problem more generally, it's useful. I think it's useful to realize that this is a problem for any semantic parsing formalism. And I think the way to think about it really is to look at semantic parsing as fundamentally a structured prediction task, okay? So the input to our semantic parser is some, I guess I said it's a sentence S, but it's really a question, okay? Like that over there on the blue thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to define some sort of probabilistic model over logical forms L, given that sentence. And whenever we're parsing, then parsing sort of corresponds to this maximization, right? Find the highest scoring logical form from some set of logical forms. And fundamentally, we need to specify what the set of logical forms is for any given sentence. And that's sort of the role of the lexicon, right? The lexicon specifies what logical forms are possible. So this bottom thing is kind of my schematic, right? So you have that question, and there's some space of logical forms that are possible, and then you're going to train some parameters that picks amongst this set of logical forms. So clearly, I mean, looking at this picture, right, that set is going to be an important factor in the semantic parser that we end up with. And I want to talk a little bit about what is a good lexicon, okay? So remember, the lexicon is what governs its maximization. And I think the way to think about a lexicon is basically in this two-dimensional space where the dimensions aren't orthogonal, unfortunately. So the first dimension is basically how big is this set, right? Now, ideally, we want the set to be small, because if there's a small number of logical forms, inference is fast, so we can search over all of them very efficiently. And also, learning is easy, in the sense that whatever our parameters are doing, they don't have to discriminate between a large number of logical forms, right? There's fewer things to choose between, so it's an easier learning problem. Now, obviously, being big is sort of on the other side, right? So we don't want it to be big, we want it to be small. Now, the tension here, unfortunately, is that the other dimension is whether or not this set actually contains a correct logical form. So if this set doesn't contain a correct logical form for a particular question, we can't get that question right, okay? So if we're down here, our parser is going to have low accuracy no matter what we do. We can't overcome the fact that our lexicon is bad. And okay, so we want to be up here where the set contains the correct logical form. The issue, of course, is that as we make the lexicon bigger, we're more likely to contain the correct logical form, right? So this direction always means we move up that way. So anyway, this is just kind of an idea of what we want in a lexicon. Ideally, we should be over there, right? We want to contain the correct logical form, but we want it to be small. OK, so let me give you an idea of sort of prior work on lexicon learning. This has sort of been a problem in semantic parsing since the beginning. But I'll say there's basically 3 different approaches to this problem. The first problem is probably the simplest. It's templates. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the data set, and I'm going to define some patterns, maybe based on the part-of-speech tags or things like that, or dependency parses. And these patterns are going to say, OK, every time I see a noun, this noun can refer to any entity in my domain. So I'm going to create a bunch of lexicon entries sort of semi-automatically and just use that lexicon to train my parser. So this has been used in a whole bunch of work in the past. Now, there's some sort of more sophisticated variants of this idea. So the first variant is basically, I'm going to take this template approach, but the problem with it is it generates a large number of lexicon entries. It might be too many to actually efficiently train a parser with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine that with some sort of structural learning, where I propose a number of lexicon entries, but then I have some sort of parameter estimation process that tries to select, hey, here are the entries that I actually want in my parser. That's kind of the second line of work. And the third line of work is basically it's similar to the second one, except instead of having these templates, it has this sort of top-down splitting process. So you start with the logical form, and you try to split it into fragments and align those to the text, essentially. Now, all of these works, I think, have, well, there's 2 limitations I'd like to point out to these works. The first is that for many of these, you have to annotate logical forms. So specifically for the lexicon templates, you typically have to annotate logical forms. For this algorithm, you also have to annotate logical forms. For these, it's sort of 50-50. But if you don't have to annotate logical forms, you have to annotate some of these lexicon templates, right? You have to make some patterns yourself every time you want to do a new domain. So this means that you sort of don't have a turnkey solution. Every time you want to train a new semantic parser, you have to do some manual work to figure out what these templates are that are going to work in your domain. So that's one limitation, right? There's sort of this bottleneck of human input that you need to put in. The second limitation is that these algorithms sort of don't have any theoretical properties, right? So specifically, the algorithms here are sort of doing a structural learning problem. And these are sort of hard, right? We're doing a discrete search over lexicons combined with a search over parameters. And we have no idea if these are going to converge or anything like that. It's sort of a heuristic process. So it can be kind of hard to control what happens with these algorithms when you're running them in practice. here's the outline of my talk. That was the introduction. It's a very simple talk. OK, so next let me talk about the lexicon learning models we developed. And just to be clear, the problem specification that we're going to look at is this, OK? As input, I'm going to get a data set of questions paired with labels, where the label is actually a set of logical forms. Now, the reason the label is a set of logical forms is because this actually generalizes many notions of weak supervision that have been explored in the literature. Specifically, if I want to train from question-answer pairs, I can enumerate a set of logical forms that actually evaluates to the correct answer. And that's going to be the label in this case. OK? So this is our training data. We get these questions with sets of logical forms as labels. And our goal is to output a CCG lexicon, which is basically a pairing of words with logical forms, and also a syntactic category, which we're just going to derive from the logical form. So just think about it as words paired with logical forms. This is our goal. Now, how are we going to go about this problem? Well, our intuition for this work is actually that lexicon learning is equivalent to word alignment in machine translation with a twist. And the twist is that the tokenization of the logical form into words isn't actually known. OK? So what do I mean by that? Well, if we think about this as an alignment problem, we have this logical form. And what we kind of want to do is we want to align fragments of this logical form to words in this question. Right? We want to align that decrease predicate to this word died, for example. But the problem is we don't know that decrease by itself is its own thing. Right? It's not a word. It's sort of part of a bigger thing. So So this is sort of what we want to get out. Right? We want to get an alignment of words to fragments of that logical form up there. But we have to figure out which fragments, right, which tokenization of this logical form we actually want. And if you think about how we actually got this tokenization, or why this one's OK, you'll say, well, this one's OK because I can take that bigger thing, and I can split it into two things, where if I apply this one to that one, I get that. And then similarly, if I apply this one to that one, I get that. Right? So if you look at this now, this looks a lot like a context-free grammar. And that's basically what we're going to do. We're just going to define a context-free grammar that simultaneously tokenizes that logical form into these fragments and aligns those to the words. Then we're going to train this grammar in a couple different ways. And that's basically the summary of this entire thing. OK? So, right. So here's our approach. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to build this grammar, which I'm calling a derivation grammar. Next I'm going to define 3 different models. Yes?
Isn't your set of logical forms per question likely to be very big, possibly even infinite?
Yeah, that's a good question in terms of how you enumerate the logical forms. So in practice, it's actually pretty reasonable to come up with some simple heuristics, like don't make them too big, use entities that are referenced in the text. We actually just automatically enumerate a pretty large set for the experiments that I tell you, and it's fine. It's not empirically a big problem. Yeah, it's a good question, though. Yeah. Technically, it's an infinite set, right? So there's an asterisk on that. OK.
So compared to previous work, the difference is in previous work, usually the lexicon is predefined, and what you're doing is the algorithm is to both derive the lexicon from the input natural language and do the parsing. So what's the difference?
So OK, that's a good question. So whenever you're doing semantic parsing in previous work, right, you need to define a lexicon and you need to train parameters, right? So anyone who's done semantic parsing has solved both of these problems. But they may have solved them in different ways, right? So a common way to solve problem 1, define a lexicon, is some heuristics, right? So I write some rules. It's not very interesting. It's like a little subsection in the evaluation part of my paper, right? And then you just do training. That's one way to do it. Now, other people have looked at lexicon learning as sort of a more interesting problem where they do it jointly with parameter estimation, right? So this is like something Luke's done and Yoav has done, right? Where there they say, OK, we're going to try and train a parser, but it's going to propose sort of some lexicon entries and then also train the parser parameters at the same time. So it's sort of part of one joint optimization. And in our case, we're going to do a pipelined approach, right? We're going to first run this to learn the lexicon. Then we're just going to do training the parameters as in the rule-based approach. OK? But that pipelined approach is going to work better than the other approaches. I will show you that in the experiments. OK? Does that make sense? Yes?
So to what degree is the enumeration of logical forms that answer the question in your model also a heuristic for defining like the set of possible logical forms? Because you're not going to go through all of them, right? That set is infinite, and you probably don't have any kind of guarantees about whether or not you're capturing the max over the infinite set.
Let me put it this way. It's very easy to write code that generally enumerates logical forms and tells you if they're correct. I can do that for any domain, right? I have the little evaluation thing. I enumerate a logical form. I run it. Do I get the right answer or not? There's no like specific work, right? It's not like writing a template for that domain. Do you see what I mean?
No.
I guess what I'm saying is there's a difference in. OK, let me put it this way. The way we enumerate logical forms is I start with a set of logical forms, and I say, do they get the right answer? And then I say, oh, here are all the ways to combine them, so I put them together. And then I evaluate them, and I say, do they get the right answer? And I repeat this process for a little while. You see what I mean? It's a very general process.
Then if you like started with a lexicon with some base logical forms, you could start just running the same process for a new domain? Or would you need to like define a new process?
Yeah, you could exactly run the same process. You just put in the predicates in that domain, and you're done. Yeah. So it's domain general. I mean, it's heuristic in the sense that you might not get the right logical form, right? Maybe it's like longer than you're willing to enumerate or something like that. But conceptually, it seems to work pretty well. I also think that if you look at recent semantic parsing work, a lot of people have actually started taking to building semantic parsers that essentially just do this enumeration, maybe guided with like some parameters that are doing like a beam search. And that seems to work fine. So I think this enumeration is pretty reasonable. OK, we're going to build this grammar. I'll tell you a little bit how we do that. We're going to define some probabilistic models based on that grammar. We're going to train these models, and then I'll tell you how to build the lexicon once we've actually trained the parameters of these models. So the first thing we're going to do is build this grammar. And the way to build this grammar is actually, I think, fairly straightforward. The idea of this grammar is that basically the non-terminal symbols in this grammar are going to be complete logical forms. And the rules are basically going to represent splitting these logical forms or aligning them to words in the text. Okay? So the way we're going to build this grammar is we're going to look at each example in the data set individually. And we're going to build a little grammar for that example. Then we're going to just union all those grammars together to build one giant grammar. So let's say this is our example that we're going to build a grammar for. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add some unary rules to the data set. So we're going to add a special symbol for that label specifically. And we're going to add a unary rule for every logical form in that set. We can go from that symbol to this thing. So the way to think about it is that label is going to be the root of the tree. And this is basically going to make us pick which of the logical forms in the set is actually the correct thing to align to this question. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to put in a bunch of these non-terminal rules or binary rules where for every logical form, we're just going to enumerate the ways to split these things into pieces and then put the pieces as the things that you can derive from that whatever logical form, right? And then we're going to recurse. So in this case, I can't do anything beyond that. But in this case, I pull out this decrease logical form. So from that, I can split it up further, et cetera, right? You can do this by just doing a depth-first search over your logical forms. And then finally, I'm going to add a bunch of terminal rules, which allow me from every logical form to generate every word in the question. Now, additionally, I'm not going to show you this here, but I'm also going to add some rules that let me skip words in the question. So in our particular domain, there's a bunch of words that are just nonsense. You don't need them. So we're just going to have some rules that let us skip words. OK, so this is how you build the grammar. And once we have this grammar, we want to build some probabilistic models. And I'm going to introduce 3 different models. And all of these models are basically going to be models of the probability of generating the question given the label. Okay? And I'm going to talk about these models through a little generative story. So here's a model which is probably going to sound a little bit silly. The independent model is going to work like this. For every word in the question, I'm going to take the label, and I'm going to generate a new tree from that label. Okay? And then I'm going to generate that word sort of from the right pre-terminal. So for predator, I generate a tree, and I generate the word predator from the leftmost symbol. For of, I'm going to generate a tree, but I'll generate it from the middle one. Here, I'll generate from the right one. Okay? Now, you're going to look at this and say, why didn't you just generate one tree? And the reason that we generate 3 different trees is because this model is actually a generalization of IBM Model 1 to our problem, okay, with the tokenization of the things. And what's nice about this model is actually it has a concave objective function. So this is the probability under the model, where this term is basically just a sum over trees. And if you think about taking the log of this, you'll realize it's a concave function of the parameters. Sorry. the parameters are basically just these emission probabilities, okay? So we're going to pick the tree uniformly at random, and there's a parameter here that says what's the probability of generating of from this particular logical form. So yeah, so anyway, so this has a concave log likelihood, which means it's easy to optimize. So that's what's nice about this independent model. And actually, in practice, this model works pretty well compared to the other models that we have. So it's kind of an interesting addition. OK, the next model I'm going to introduce is called the coupled model. And this basically fixes the thing that you would have said is stupid about the previous model, which is that it generates one tree, and it makes all of the text get generated from that single tree. OK, now we're still going to generate the tree uniformly at random. And the reason that we're going to do that is because this grammar has a large number of logical forms in it, right? It has a lot of non-terminal symbols. So it's actually very hard to learn the parameters of this grammar because there's just so many different rules. So generating the trees uniformly at random kind of allows us to avoid that problem. And OK, so this model is basically just learning the parameters of a latent PCFG. And so the log likelihood is like a sum over trees, or the probability of a sentence, question. And these are sort of the probabilities, right? We have these terminal probabilities. So this is sort of again, standard application of learning a latent PCFG. I'm going to introduce a third model, which we call PAL, which is sort of our best model. And this is basically the coupled model where we also are going to learn these non-terminal probability distributions. So you can see these two equations are the same. Here I've added this non-terminal thing that we're actually going to learn. And the twist here is actually what we're going to do in order to make these distributions easy to learn, or easier to learn, is we're actually going to parameterize these probabilities with log linear models. Okay? So there's this paper on painless unsupervised learning. I don't know if you've seen it, but we're basically just using that trick. So these are going to be log linear models, and we're going to train them. They have the form like this. There's some features here. And what's nice about this is the features can generalize over the different kinds of non-terminal production rules, right? So things that conceptually in your head look similar but have different symbols in them can actually get similar feature vectors here and similar probabilities. So that's basically how this model is going to work. OK. Now, so those are the three models. How are we going to train these things? I'm just going to cover this in like 30 seconds, which is, we have this data. We're just going to maximize the log likelihood of the data with EM. Okay? It's a standard application of EM. You can, for the convex model, you can do this really, really quickly. For the other models, it's sort of, again, learning a latent PCFG. With the PAL model, you have to do a sort of LBFGS optimization to solve the parameters of these log linear models internally. But it's all kind of standard stuff. It's fairly straightforward. OK, now once you've trained the models, how do you actually get the lexicon out, right? So I have a model. It can predict a tree for this thing. How do I actually get a lexicon? Well, what I do is I parse my example, right? So I condition on that being the label. If it was a set, it would be a set, but I guess here it's a logical form. I condition on this being the question, and I say, what's the most likely tree? Hopefully I get this tree, because this is a good tree. And then what I do is I basically take these alignments for the words at the bottom, and I throw away the internal structure of the tree, and I generate syntactic categories just based on where the arguments were applied in the sentence. So that would look something like this. Oh, and the semantic type. So for example, decrease got applied to frogs, so its syntactic category says it's a function that takes an animal on that side. So if you're familiar with like Tom Kwiatkowski's UBL thing, it's exactly the same way we're going to generate these syntactic categories. OK, that's it for the models. Now I'm going to talk about some experiments we've done to measure how well these models actually perform. OK, so for this evaluation, we're going to use a data set of these food chain questions like I mentioned. So this is a data set we collected using Mechanical Turk, basically using a sort of paraphrase task. So we start with the questions that we know are good, and we have them paraphrase them to kind of generate new questions. And this is sort of an example of the kinds of questions that are in there. And we're going to evaluate everything by doing 5-fold cross-validation. So I split this data into 5 folds, train on 4, evaluate on the last one. There's some subtlety here with the food chains, because each question references a food chain. So each fold, all the questions about a single food chain are in one fold. It's kind of a technical detail. That's not really a big deal. OK. So just to give you an idea of what's in this data set, here are some example questions from the data set. And I want to point out 2 or 3 things about these questions that I think are different compared to other semantic parsing data sets. I think the first one is that the questions are actually quite long. So on average, we have about 1.5 times the words of a data set like GeoQuery. The second thing I want to point out is a lot of the words in these questions are really not that important. Okay? So in a data set like GeoQuery, most of the words are actually significant. They actually map to symbols in the logical, logical form fragments or whatever, right? They're actually lexicon entries. In our case, there are lots of words like, will probably, that doesn't really matter. We can basically ignore that word. The third thing I want to point out is actually the lexical diversity in this data set is also fairly large. So there's a lot of different ways to reference things that are actually the same, right? So we have a predicate called decrease, which gets applied when an animal is dying, right? There's fewer of them. And there's lots of ways to do that, right? So you can say it'll starve. You can say it'll become extinct. You can say the sun is blocked by clouds. There's lots of different ways to say the predicate decrease. So that's another challenge about this data set. So I'm going to put this up. Just hold on for a second. Let me explain how we ran our experiments. So what I did to run these experiments, we're going to do an end-to-end evaluation where we take the questions that we have, right, for one of our folds. We run whatever lexicon learning method. Then we take that lexicon and we feed it into a semantic parser, and we train that semantic parser with that lexicon, okay? And then we're going to evaluate the question answering accuracy of the final semantic parser. So ultimately, we want to get the questions right. That's the whole point of creating these lexicons. So I sort of think this is the right metric. Now, in terms of actually evaluating our lexicon learning models versus other models, what we did is we took the other lexicon learning models. We actually used their implementations, except this one. And we, some of these actually learned parameters and the lexicon at the same time. So we actually threw away the parameters, took the lexicon, and trained our own semantic parser with it. So that way, all of the implementation details of the parser are consistent. As a side note, our parser does better than their parsers whenever we tried both. So just, that's not a factor in this evaluation. OK, so this is a graph, right? This is the accuracy of the parser. Did you get the question right? These are the different baselines. The first baseline actually isn't a semantic parser at all.
So just to be clear, this is not question answering, this is parsing. Is that right?
No, you get a logical form, but then you predict an answer. So it's like you predict a denotation, basically, and is that denotation right?
Okay.
Right, so like, you can
predict. In this case, it's the same thing, assuming you've got the right food chain?
There are a couple times where two different logical forms will evaluate to the same thing, right? So a common example is like, if I eat something, then like when I decrease, it decreases. So like there's like two logical forms there that you can get that are the same, or that give you the same answer in a lot of circumstances. And it's whether or not you got that output right. So both of those would be correct in our evaluation. But ultimately, you care about did you get the answer right. You don't care about did you get the logical form right. So I think that's kind of the right metric.
You have no logical forms as supervision, right?
Yeah, we have the answers, and we enumerate logical forms automatically.
Where do the labels come from in the logical forms? Or are they all just sort of...
The labels in the logical forms?
Yeah, like decrease is a predicate in your logical forms. How do you get that?
We have a set of predicates. We have a little representation for like a theory of food chains, if you will, right? So there's like, I don't know, it's probably like 30 predicates or something, right? And there's like things like plant, animal, decrease, increase, causation. Sort of in the same way with GeoQuery, you'd have like, city, state, these things, and sort of programmed in. And the way to evaluate those is also programmed in, right? So if you get something like what's a plant, and you give me a food chain, I can tell you these are the things that are plants. That's sort of built into the system. Good question. Yeah?
I think you already said this, but how do you train things like UBL without logical forms?
So that's why it says plus LF over there, and I'm going to get into that in a second. Yeah. OK, so PMI it's not even a semantic parsing baseline. It uses co-occurrence statistics on the web to guess an answer. So this one actually gets like 4 answer options, though. So it's not totally a comparable number. I really shouldn't have put it on this chart. Anyway, the next 4 are actually interesting baselines. So these are all lexicon learning algorithms that have been proposed in prior work. So UBL is this top-down splitting algorithm by Tom Kwiatkowski et al. And so for all of these baselines, I just want to point out that all of these require more supervision than ours. Okay, so we're training on question-answer pairs with these automatically enumerated logical forms. For these guys, we actually have to annotate logical forms for both UBL and ZC 2007. And all of these other 3 required us to build these little lexicon templates, these patterns that create lexicon entries, sort of heuristically for our domain. Okay, anyway, so these are our baselines, right? So we've got UBL. This is prior work, the top-down splitting thing. ZC 2007 is Luke Zettelmoyer, and it basically has this algorithm where it proposes, it overgenerates templates for each example, then tries to prune them sort of iteratively. ADP 2014 is a Yoav Artsy, and it's similar to the Zettelmoyer algorithm, except it has a sort of it has a batch pruning step, which kind of keeps the lexicon sizes down. And then finally, actually, this bottom one is just part of speech heuristics. So this is, I sat down and wrote some templates that said, every noun can be this. And I kind of engineered them a little bit, and that actually does the best out of all these baselines on this data set.
Are the templates you're giving to that the same ones you're giving to?
Yeah, so actually what I did is I made the templates for this first, and then I used them in those. So these templates actually have pretty high coverage. They can parse about 90-something%. Like in the Oracle 100 beam, 90-something% are correct. So yeah, this evaluation is actually kind of complicated to get all these things to work, but I tried to do a good job in terms of like, can we get the right answers with these different algorithms? That's a good question. OK, so how do our algorithms actually do? Well, here's the results of our lexicon learning algorithm. So the independent model already outperforms all of the baselines by actually a fairly significant amount. And this is nice, right? Because remember, this is an easy model optimizer. It has a concave objective function. Our other two models seem to do slightly better. I mean, this one's about the same. This one gets maybe 2% on top of the independent model. This is based on learning the actual non-terminal distribution parameters. So anyway, this is kind of a nice result, right? We're winning here. Now, something else I want to say is that actually, in addition to getting higher accuracy on this data set, we also get smaller lexicons. So here's a plot of the number of lexicon entries that were averaged across all folds that were learned by each model, or produced by each model. And the y-axis is basically the parse time. So smaller lexicons tend to give you smaller parse times, but that's not necessarily true. And you can see that all three of our models are clustered down here in the bottom. So PAL is doing like a 1 millisecond parse of some sort. And the other, well, three of the baselines are sort of out here with much larger lexicons and much slower parse times. One baseline's here, so ADP 2014 is down here. But the performance, the accuracy difference between our models and that model is actually quite significant. So yes.
Sorry, is Yoav's lexicon smaller or bigger than yours?
It is slightly bigger, but the parser is faster. I'll go with Mike and then Nick.
Can these other models skip words somewhat? Because your model can skip words, the other one.
Yes.
Okay.
I put that in the templates, so there's like a skip word thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe you're going to show this next, but do you have results on the other data sets?
Yeah, so I have geoquery results on the next slide. Great. OK, and we also ran this on geoquery. So this comparison isn't totally fair for a reason I'll point out in a second. But Tom Kwiatkowski with UBL is getting about 88. We're getting about 82. The reason this isn't a totally fair comparison is actually we're sort of doing a very vanilla CCG parse. We learn a lexicon, and we just parse with that lexicon. Whereas Tom has these factored lexicon entries, which basically expand the number of things in the lexicon. So it's like there's things that weren't seen in the training data set literally, but you can use at test time. Similarly, ZC 2007 has these relaxed parsing operators, which actually basically let you do things at test time that you can't do at training time. So we can actually add all that stuff to our model, but we just didn't think it was super interesting to like really optimize to get the best geoquery performance. So this is sort of, it is what it is. Yeah?
So how do you explain like the huge difference in the trend between geoquery?
Well, I think the data set characteristics are actually very different, right? So the big difference, I think, between these models and our model is that we have a generative model, and those are discriminative models, right? So in our data set, with all these distractor words, it's actually much harder to like just guess some entries and get the right answer, right? So the discriminative training doesn't really work well in our data set, right? Because there's so many more parses. It's just much more challenging. So our model can deal with that fact, right? Because as this generative thing, we can always do the parsing in the CFG. It's not an issue. Does that make sense? I've thought about. So actually, if you look at if you just think about the number of lexicon entries that the different models search over, right? Like our model actually, like on our data set, or even on this data set, we actually search over more lexicon entries that are candidate lexicon entries than like these other algorithms. But we're able to learn a better lexicon, right? So I think that it's a function of the generative objective. Okay. That's the end of my talk, actually. So just to summarize, I've presented some probabilistic models for learning the lexicon of a semantic parser. And there's basically three advantages. So first of all, our models can be trained from question-answer pairs and other kinds of weak supervision. Second, we have convergence and optimality guarantees in the sense that all of our things converge because we're running EM. But our simplest model actually has a concave objective function, which means you can find the best lexicon. And finally, I've demonstrated that we get higher accuracy in smaller lexicons relative to prior work. Thank you.
You also compared the number of lexicons on the geoquery dataset.
I didn't, but I could figure that out.
Because like I was wondering is there any characteristic of your objective that will encourage small lexicon? So maybe a small lexicon is beneficial for the food chain dataset, but not for the geoquery dataset.
Oh. Interesting. So I didn't compare the sizes. I don't think they were like that dramatically different. I think part of what happens in okay, so in geoquery, most of the words are meaningful. So I would guess there's sort of like a hard bound on sort of how many lexicon entries you want, and sort of every word has a particular logical form or a small set of logical forms that it refers to. In the food chain data set, you're sort of able to way overgenerate these logical forms because there's all these sort of noise words, and you're able to attach logical forms to them, or lexicon entries. And you're able to attach logical forms to them when you should really just be skipping them. So I think there'll actually probably be comparable lexicons on geoquery, whereas in like this other data set, they're not. Comparable lexicon sizes. Does that make sense?
So, I don't know if in ADIS there's a lot more skipping that's involved, but if that's like a core advantage, that might be some, like it's more natural text, right? So there should be less symbols attached to all the words.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it, but I can check it out. Yeah.
So that's when you were doing some sort of like syntactic subcategorization for just different like noun types. Like you had N sub A. You had, yeah.
Yeah. This is just my way of denoting that I created a separate noun category for each semantic type of the logical form.
That is actually in the grammar.
That's in the grammar. I also put that in the grammars of the other lexicons that I created. So I did some work to make sure that the lexicons were sort of comparable and like handled word skipping in the right way and these kinds of things.
Can you be sure that you said you used the implementations?
So for UVL and ZC 2007, I used Yoav's UWSPF implementation.
Are you sure they handle this kind of syntactic subcategorization correctly?
No, they create their own lexicon, but I just fix the lexicon to have the right syntactic categories after. You see what I mean? They're training their own parser. It's a whole different thing.
Yeah, but in the templates that you put in.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just put in these in the templates. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just not sure.
No, they're separate syntactic categories. They're not subcategories. They're just separate things, right? Because you can't like, there's nothing that actually has this as a variable that fills it in. Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
your algorithm needs you to be able to enumerate all the logical forms with a given delimitation.
Yeah.
And that seems reasonable in these cases where you've got fairly small schema, like in geoquery there isn't a lot of variety. In this domain, it looks like it's mostly things causing decreases from the examples you showed. I'm wondering how this would work on something like free-based question answering, where for answer like Obama or something, it's going to be gazillion different questions that would...
I think if you take the fact that the answer is Obama and some entities mentioned in the text, there's actually not that many logical forms. And if you look at the actual work on that, a lot of them actually do just enumerate logical forms, right? Like think about like Jonathan Barant's semantic parsing by paraphrasing. He literally enumerates logical forms and generates text from them. So that approach actually works pretty well in that data set. I think if you had, so geoquery, actually, we didn't enumerate logical forms. We used the labels like everybody else did, right? But I don't think you could enumerate the ones for geoquery because they're much more complicated. So there's definitely a good question there. There's this like question of like, can I enumerate the logical forms on my data set? And I think the answer is, For a large fraction of data sets, the answer is yes. In the other cases, I don't know what you're going to do anyway.
So as part of the lexicon learning, you're learning the PCFG that produces the logical form. So could you just use that when you need the full power of CCG, or could you just do the PCFG with semantics? Or is that
Yeah, this is something I wanted to say, but the PCFG cannot parse new questions. It can only generate derivations for questions whose logical form labels you've seen. So it doesn't that's actually important. That's what differentiates the PCFG from just parsing with the CCG parser, is that in the PCFG, you can only combine things that have been seen to combine, right, on that example. So for example, if I see let's go back and get a good example of this. Let's look at this, right? So let's look at eats x bass, right? Now, if I had a CCG parse, and I had bass sitting somewhere, and I had x eats x bass, I could combine those to get eats bass bass, right? That would be possible in the CCG grammar. But it's not possible in the CFG, because there's no way to get from eats bass bass to one of these labels, right? So there's actually a subset of the derivations that would be possible under a CCG. I mean, that's actually what makes it possible to train and all this stuff. That's sort of the key advantage of this thing. Really should have said it earlier.
And then just to be clear, you, to generate a tree, sample uniformly from the trees that are possible, given?
Yeah, given the label.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that works.
Well, you have the word parameters at the bottom, right? So each tree is not uniformly likely to generate the actual question.
Okay, well, let's thank our speaker again.